Good day to you, and how do you do? This is Professor Tatum here with our lecture for History 1302. Today, we will be looking at what history is and why we should care. As an overview, we will be looking into a few main topics here. Number one, investigating the question, what is history? Number two, why should we care? And then number three, we're going to look into a case study to understand historical interpretations. Okay. So what we're going to do here is look into the first subject, topic, time period that we're really going to be exploring in our class, which is the period known as Reconstruction, where the South was being reconstructed toward the end of the Civil War and in the decade or so following the Civil War. Okay. And what we'll see there is that history is not something that's just fixed. It's something that different people understand and explain, hence interpret in different ways. Okay. All right. So when I'm asking here, what is history? I'm not asking about the past, what happened in the past. I'm talking about the discipline, the study, the field of history. What does it mean to be a student in a history class? What subject are we investigating here? I understand history to be a series of interpretations that help us understand and explain the past. Okay. And understanding history really requires us to ask a lot of questions. So sometimes we'll ask questions like who, what, where, when. Okay. Who was involved? What was happening? Where was this? What time period? Um, the bigger questions that really drive historical interpretations are those deep ones, the why, the how. Why did this happen the way that it did? How does point A here lead to point B? Why was this guy such an asshole? And how did that impact the way that he approached certain scenarios? But before getting straight into one's interpretation, it is crucial for historians to set some kind of context, meaning essentially setting the stage, providing some historical background of what you're trying to interpret. Okay. This requires answering those who, what, where, and when questions. Okay. Who's going to be involved here? What topic are we talking about? Where is this happening? And more or less in what time period? Understanding those things can help make our interpretations, the why and how, make a little more sense. Okay. And when we write essays for our class, this is exactly what I'm going to want to see. I don't want to see you provide me some context, tell me who, what, when, where generally we're talking about, and then provide me an interpretation through your thesis. We'll talk about all that more as we move forward. All right, so let's try to understand historical interpretations. A lot of people will try to tell you that having conflicting interpretations is people changing our history, right? And there's this big kind of idea out there that schools are changing our history, and us college professors, we're the worst. We're just trying to ruin the past and change what happened through history. We're rewriting history. Well, I'd hope people continue to update history. Okay. We're trying to interpret and understand and explain it in different ways. All right. We're not arguing about what happened. We just understand it differently. Okay. My interpretation as an educated individual in the 21st century who's been through a master's program in history in the 21st century is going to be far different than, say, your dad's high school coach who taught him history. Okay. The historical interpretations must meet a few criteria to really be taken seriously. All right. Number one, a good historical interpretation must be contestable, meaning that other historians can either agree with it or disagree with it. Okay. Based on the evidence that they're exploring. Okay. Because that's another key to historical interpretations. They're not just your thoughts and feelings. They can involve some of that, but they need to be strictly based on the evidence that you're exploring. Okay. We want to keep them grounded as much as possible in evidence. All right. So that leads us to another question. What type of evidence do historians explore? Historians use multiple types of evidence. We try to rely pretty heavily on what we call primary sources, meaning sources being studied in the period. This can include things like newspapers, letters, diaries, photographs, firsthand accounts of historical events. But we also look pretty frequently into secondary sources. Okay, this is where us historians kind of have discourse with each other. These are sources created after the time that we're studying, where us historians ourselves provide our interpretations based on the primary evidence we're exploring or the other secondary sources that we're putting into conversation with each other. Okay. This includes things like monographs, meaning a historical book based on our research and interpretations of that research, biographies of historical figures, journal articles, documentaries, podcasts, All of these things where people after the time that we're studying are exploring a topic are considered secondary sources, all right? And a good historian will use a little bit of both of these in making a historical interpretation. Now, one thing that's crucial as we study history is to be able to have empathy without necessarily having sympathy, all right? To be able to be empathetic even when you're not sympathetic. Now, what do I mean by that? It's important for us to be able to understand and observe a topic and really try to get to an understanding of why things happen the way they did and how one thing impacts another without letting our personal opinions about it get in the way of understanding it. Okay. We also need to understand that just because we're exploring something and trying to understand it doesn't mean we have to agree with it at all. Okay. So, as an example, I like to use pretty frequently, a lot of my studies in grad school were about indigenous peoples, Native Americans. Um, and I can very well sit here and explain Andrew Jackson's reasoning behind or at least his justification behind the Indian removal policy. Okay. And why he thought it was a good idea, or at least expressed that it was a good idea to forcefully remove groups like the Cherokees from their homeland. Now, does that mean I agree with what Jackson did? Not at all. I find it despicable, okay? But I can still not allow my disagreement with Jackson there to interfere with my understanding of his policies and why he did what he did, or at least how he justified what he did. See what I mean? That's what we need to do as we're studying history. All right, so there's a lot of common misconceptions about history. If any of you happen to be a history major, you're going to find that anytime somebody first discovers that you're a history major, they want to sit there and play trivia with you. They want to test you and drop some little facts they expect you to be impressed with. Because a lot of people assume that history is just a lot of names and dates and fun facts, which it is not, okay? I don't care that Abraham Lincoln's top hat was yay inches tall and that he only got top hats from X and X company, or that Ulysses S. Grant only smoked this type of cigar. Well, that one I might want to know so I can try it myself, but that's a different story. Point I'm getting at, if we're going to be including that kind of little information, it has to be helping us get to a bigger picture, all right? It has to help us understand and explain. Now, if we have names, dates, events, and things that can work as evidence, that's one thing. But just knowing all these little facts isn't very helpful. Okay. By that standard, history is not trivial. Okay. It should never be something that we consider to be just having the information for the sake of knowing it. All right. Trivia is good, fun, and fine. I love playing the question of day on the Alexa. Um, I used to do it every night. I've kind of lost the habit. But trivia is good, great, fun, and fine, but it is not equated to the study of history. Okay, so let all these ideas of history out the door as you approach our class. All right, so we have somewhat of an understanding of what it means to study history, but why should we care? Okay, why are we doing this, and why are we all required in the state of Texas to take history classes, even if we're nothing near a history major? There's a few reasons. Now, of course, understanding our past and where we come from and how that's shaped who we are is very important, but that's secondary compared to some of the skills that we practice in the study of history that'll benefit anybody of any major and what no matter what your career path is that you're following. Okay. So one thing we do a lot of as we study history is reading and writing. All right. So we got to exercise effective reading and writing skills in order to be successful in history. And if you're wondering what that has to do with you and how that's going to benefit you, just take a look here. Anybody, regardless of what plans you have as far as careers go, no matter what your major is, you're going to need some kind of skills in reading and writing. Okay, so I've broken down just a few here. If you're in the medical field, all right, if that's something you're working toward, you're going to need to be able to read and write patient charts, prescriptions, side effects, medical articles, hospital and clinic policies. You need to understand government regulations that you're going to have to be able to read about. And you're going to be able to need to write patient referrals and care plans. I get a lot of students from science and engineering thinking, well, what does this have to do with me? Okay, science. You guys need to be reading and writing articles on recent scientific studies, right? Staying updated. Also, need to be writing some proposals for funding. Okay, engineers, you guys need to be looking at blueprints, construction contracts, permits, manuals, company policies, government regulations. All right, point I'm getting at here. the reading and writing skills we're practicing as we study history will be beneficial to all of you, okay? And really, if we think about it, studying history is a lot like exercise, okay? I remind my classes as we get through the semester, and I can kind of tell people are burning out a little bit. I say, guys, remember what we're doing here. We're exercising, okay? We're exercising essential skills that are going to be crucial to our success in our other classes and in our professions and even perhaps in our personal lives, okay? So regardless of what you're doing, some of the things we're practicing in this class will be helpful for you. In addition to the reading and writing skills we'll be practicing, we're going to be considering different types of perspective, using evidence to understand those perspectives. We'll also be practicing empathy, even when we're not sympathetic. My Lord, does the world need more of that? As well as critical thinking, something that is kind of going to the wayside as we throw away our critical thinking skills to things like AI. Now, AI can be very helpful and useful in different ways, though not permitted to be used in this classroom for important reasons. But we should never allow it to replace our ability to critically think and make decisions for ourselves and do research and come to learn things on our own. Another crucial skill we're practicing as we study history is making rational interpretations or assessments based on evidence. Okay, again, this is something no matter what career path you take, you're going to need to do. Scientists, how does the scientific method work, right? You've got to make your hypothesis, right? And you got to observe some evidence. You got to get data based on that evidence, and you got to assess that evidence. That's what we're doing with history. We're looking at evidence, assessing it, making interpretations accordingly, okay? Medical field, once again, bring you guys up. You have a patient come in, whether you're a doctor or a nurse, you've got to observe some evidence. You got to listen to what that patient's telling you. You got to read their charts. You got to check their vitals and observe. You got to see their symptoms. And then you've got to observe all that evidence together to make an assessment of what might be wrong with this patient, okay, in order to provide a diagnosis. So a lot of these skills we're practicing, though it may not seem like it in the moment, are going to greatly benefit you along the way. Another thing we're doing is demonstrating our interpretations and assessment through discussion and writing. Okay, again, something that'll be very helpful for a lot of you as you move forward throughout your education and definitely into your professional lives. And please don't be one of those people who just says, well, we can just use AI. I don't need to get good at reading and writing and understanding things. I'll just type my question into the robot and let it think for me. All right. That's getting fake exercise. That's like being SpongeBob here with the anchor arms. And eventually, those anchor arms are going to whoop out on you, and you're really going to be struggling in comparison to somebody else who has been going through this process and taking this seriously and learning how to read and write and critically think. We need to be mindful, though, that what you get out of your study of history is going to largely be based on what you put into it. All right. So if you're just kind of coming into class every now and then, skipping most classes, and then you go try to just Google half the answers for the review, and when I'm asking questions in class, you have no idea what's going on because you haven't been doing the readings and watching the videos, you're probably not going to get much out of this, and you're going to get bored very quickly. Or if you come in here just thinking, okay, how do I just get the A without having to learn anything from this? You're going to get bored very quickly. But if you come in here and you say, I am here to participate, I'm here to learn, I'm here to grow, I promise you, I will help you as much as I can along the way. All right. That ties into my teaching philosophy, which is I care about all of you. I want you all to succeed. I'll do what I can to help you, guide you, get you going. At the same time, I cannot care more than you. All right. It's up to you to be there doing your part, seeking that support in order to get it. Okay. Another reason we should study history comes down to the need in our present day world for educated individuals. Okay. I can't play this video on the Zoom, unfortunately, because we won't get audio. But I would strongly recommend you guys to take a few minutes to watch this thing. This is a fantastic video I play every semester for my classes. This is a video geared actually toward high school AP history students who are earning college credits while they're in high school. But everything the speaker in this video has to say is very relevant to any students of history in the 21st century. Okay. All right, so we generally understand now what the field of history is. I provided us some reasons for why it's important, why we should care, how it's going to help us out. Now let's start studying some history, okay? Let's take a look at one subject in history and understand how different people interpret it. So first, let's try to understand what this period we're looking at is, Reconstruction. Okay, I put dates here for reference. In this class, I never care that you know these specific dates. I'm not going to test you on that. This is just helping us see, okay? If we know the Civil War ended in 1865, this is starting during the Civil War and carrying on beyond it, okay, for another about 12 years. So this is a period at the end of the Civil War and immediately following the Civil War, defined by efforts to reconstruct the war-torn South and bring it back into the United States. That's what we call Reconstruction, right? And what historians have debated over time is the meaning of Reconstruction. Okay, we're not debating whether or not this thing happened. Okay, we understand that there was this process of trying to bring the South back into the Union. We know there were different people with different ideas. We know who the presidents were in this period. Okay, we had Lincoln, Johnson, and Grant. Uh, we know that there were different Union generals involved. None of that is debated. Okay, we know the facts. We agree on that. What we, as historians, tend to kind of see differently is the sense that we make of these things. What does this tell us? How do we understand this? All right. That's what historical interpretations differ on. So it's not that anybody's changing our history. We're trying to understand it and view it in ways that make a little more sense based on different perspectives we may be considering or based on our understanding of the evidence. All right. As we'll see, sometimes historical bias does come into play, and we need to try to be mindful of that as we examine studies of history as well. Okay, so one of the earliest interpretations provided on this period of Reconstruction has become known as the Dunning School. So the Dunning School refers to history that follows a school of thought under a historian named William Dunning and a member of his cohort, John W. Burgess. So this school of thought described Reconstruction as a very shameful period, and they focused on the fact that there was a great deal of government corruption, and they claimed that there was a conspiracy against the South throughout this period of Reconstruction, all right? And that some individuals in Congress, known as radical Republicans, were working with freedmen, carpetbaggers, and scalawags to install these inefficient biracial governments in the South, okay? And that they were intent on keeping the South suppressed so that the North could continue to grow and the South would lag behind. Who are all these people we're talking about here? They're kind of important to understand as we continue. Very quick, simple definitions here. Okay, so radical Republicans. These are Republican congressmen in the late 19th century favored what were considered to be radical or revolutionary concepts. Okay, so when I use those words in this context of studying Reconstruction, words like revolutionary and radical, I don't necessarily mean dangerous. I'm saying transformative. Okay. If we think of what a revolution really is, it's a total change. Well, that's what I'm talking about when I say revolutionary here. The ideas that were considered to be so revolutionary in this period, what were they? Things like abolishing slavery, right? And providing civil rights for African Americans. Examples of radical Republicans, pretty prominent, who you want to be familiar with, are Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, Benjamin Wade, and Henry Davis. Freed people is the term I use. Freedmen is commonly used in history. I like freed people, it's just a little more encompassing. But these are formerly enslaved African Americans, okay? Another term here, carpetbaggers. These were Northerners who came down to the South during Reconstruction and contributed toward the efforts of Reconstruction, okay? These were sometimes Army officers, they were sometimes teachers, sometimes people helping build things, businessmen coming down to the South, and they were seen by the Dunning School as people who were there to cheat the South and take advantage of its weakness. Then there were scalawags. Okay, scalawags were Southerners, people living in the South who supported Reconstruction. Since they were Southerners, they were expected to oppose these Northerners pushing their agenda, quote unquote, as the Dunning School suggested, onto the South. Therefore, they were considered to be traitors, right? They were dissenters who had no business supporting Reconstruction. So this school of thought, the Dunning School, this original kind of public interpretation was really based on some kind of antiquated and not very accurate ideas about race. Okay, So the Dunning School suggested that African Americans were kind of incapable of making these decisions for themselves. And that the idea here was that African Americans were somehow racially inferior. Okay, remember, we got to use that empathy, not sympathy. I'm not advocating this by any means, but this guy did, so we need to understand his argument here. Okay? His argument's all based on this idea of African Americans being racially inferior. Okay, and so he's suggesting that the radical Republicans, along with scalawags and carpetbaggers, are using their support for African Americans to install them into government where they have no place being, and that's keeping the South suppressed. Okay. And really, this Dunning School's argument and interpretation and understanding of this period of Reconstruction was used kind of as a warning to future generations. Okay. They said, look, here's what happens if we have biracial government, if we have people of different races working together. We tried that once and it led to violence and corruption. Let's not try it again. Okay. So this is a kind of long-standing interpretation that lasted for several decades with very little challenge. Okay? So I can kind of understand why somebody who understands this evidence in a different way, with more kind of valid understandings of race and what it really is, and understand that African Americans are not somehow inherently inferior, might want to publicly assert a different understanding of Reconstruction. Okay. All right. This Dunning School interpretation of Reconstruction and of the Civil War, though, was strongly pushed by a film called The Birth of a Nation. Right? There's a more recent film in the 21st century called The Birth of a Nation, completely different film. What this was a popular film in 1915 that kind of really reinforced this idea of racial inferiority and of the North trying to oppress the war-torn South. And in this film, you can look up clips from it on YouTube. We'll actually review a clip of it in a later class. But the way it pretty much plays out is there's all kinds of sexual violence by African Americans on white people as they gain all these freedoms. There's scenes of them in the floor of Congress with their feet up on the table, drinking on the job because they're not fit to be politicians, and it's leading to all these problems in the South. And then at the end of the film, here comes the Ku Klux Klan with white robes and burning crosses to redeem the South and bring it back to its former glory. Okay. This was a very popular film, by the way. President Woodrow Wilson actually publicly screened this at the White House. And this is a way that people understood Reconstruction for quite some time. There was pretty early on, though, a counter interpretation to this. Okay. Another historian said, look, if we look at different perspectives, we can understand this all in a different way. That was W.E.B. Du Bois. All right. He provided the first notable contrast to the Dunning School's interpretation. All right. And he did so in a book called Black Reconstruction in America. It actually has a much longer title than that, but historians can't keep up with the role Black folk played in the Reconstruction of the American South, or whatever the full title is. So we just call it Black Reconstruction in America. All right. And in this book, he understood Reconstruction in a different way. He saw it as a period of temporary progress for African Americans that provided a great amount of hope. All right. He said this is where African Americans were freed from bondage, where they gained citizenship and were first allowed to vote and allowed to participate in government. This was a period of tremendous progress. Okay. But unfortunately, Du Bois was largely ignored by historians for decades. Okay. So for several decades, up until about the 1960s, that Dunning School interpretation dominated historians' understanding of Reconstruction. And of course, that was pushed onto the public through The Birth of a Nation, and then other books and films and TV shows kind of played in that same understanding of this period. But then in the 1960s, okay, there were people largely influenced by what we call the politics of history. All right. And that's individuals and historians involved in and witnessing the African American civil rights movement of the 1960s, which is sometimes referred to as the Second Reconstruction. All right. So in this period, we saw a group of historians known as revisionist historians who began revisiting some of the African American sources that had been largely ignored by historians for decades. All right, they started revisiting works like Black Reconstruction in America, trying to understand how Du Bois came to his perspective. And they also came to suggest that Reconstruction was a time of tremendous progress. Okay, again, though, we can see that definitely their bias of their present day had some kind of impact on the way they viewed Reconstruction. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I'm not saying one way or another, but it's something we need to be aware of. We call that the politics of history, okay? How we view and understand the world will, to an extent, impact the way we view and understand history, okay? The same could be said for the Dunning School. Dunning and his cohort had a very specific understanding of race and superiority and inferiority between races, and that impacted their view of history, okay? All right, but then another generation of historians began to emerge a little after the revisionists. They became known as post-revisionists. Okay, so post-revisionists contested both with the Dunning School and with the revisionists. They provided a much more cynical view of this period of Reconstruction. Okay, they saw it as maybe something that's been overplayed. Maybe it never really had much hope of making as much progress as we'd like to kick it up to. Uh, they said that it really didn't lead to many long-lasting changes. Okay, and in that way, the Dunning School was right. Now, they didn't necessarily agree with the Dunning School's ideas about race, but they did have a very cynical view. So, for example, they suggested that during this period of Reconstruction, there was a lot of schools open in the South for African Americans, but they suggested that the purpose of those schools was not necessarily to provide quality education for African Americans, but was more so to push Northern industrial capitalist agendas on African Americans in the South. Okay. So much different understanding of this period of Reconstruction than, say, the revisionists or W.B. Du Bois. But that's not to say that they're living through this antiquated view on race that was prominent in the Dunning School's interpretation of history. All right, then from this generation of post revisionists came a historian named Eric Foner. Eric Foner provided the first, what we call modern synthesis of Reconstruction from start to finish, breaking it down into periods. And Foner borrowed a bit from both revisionists and post revisionists. He saw that there was some tremendous progress made throughout Reconstruction. Things like the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which defined citizenship and guaranteed due process under the law, and had all kinds of other implications. We could honestly spend an entire lecture talking about the 14th Amendment and then the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African Americans the right to vote. Okay, all these things were made possible during this period of Reconstruction, in addition to several other changes. But this period of Reconstruction, as we'll see, was cut rather short, and there was ways to kind of suppress a lot of these progresses, a lot of these impacts. There's a way to suppress African Americans from expressing a lot of these newfound rights. And Foner's big argument is that Reconstruction was an unfinished revolution, suggesting something we're still continuing to grapple with. Okay, suggesting that, for example, during what's sometimes called the Second Reconstruction, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights leaders were largely still grappling with issues that were trying to be addressed, that people had tried to address during this moment of Reconstruction. Okay, and then in many cases, civil rights activists have turned back to things like the 14th and 15th Amendments as a basis for their legal arguments. We're still grappling with some of these notions that were set forth during this period of Reconstruction. All right, it's an unfinished revolution. Foner's synthesis here has set the foundation for other historians to work from. Okay, we no longer have to use this antiquated view of Reconstruction posed by the Dunning School as our basis to understand this period. All right, we now have a more kind of updated synthesis with a more modern interpretation. And from here, historians have been able to focus in more on different aspects of this bigger period of Reconstruction. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a pretty good idea of how the study of history works. Okay, and you can see here that historians are not trying to change your history. We're trying to understand and explain history in different ways, and consider different perspectives, and in some case consider different types of sources to try to better understand and explain. All right, another thing I'd like to suggest is we've seen a kind of a linear overview of the history of Reconstruction here, but within each of those generations, okay, within the revisionist generation, within the post-revisionist generation, and with even these more modern historians here, we see within each of those groups historians disagreeing with each other, right? Posing counter interpretations and counter arguments based on their understandings and explanations of different evidence in different ways. Okay. So hopefully that helps you understand what we do as historians. And hopefully the earlier part of this lecture also helped you see why this is important and why it matters to you. All right. I'll see you guys in class. Always feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you soon. Have a good one.